My name is Marcus Webb, and I live alone in a farmhouse off Route 12, about 40 minutes outside of Columbus, Ohio. The nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away through thick pine forest. I inherited this place from my grandfather 6 years ago. Before that, I spent most of my adult life in Columbus, working in IT, living in a cramped apartment that smelled like takeout grease and other people's cigarettes. The farmhouse was supposed to be my fresh start. I didn't expect it to become my prison. The dog was a beagle named Chester. I'd gotten him as a puppy from a shelter when I was 24, back when I still believed life would turn out fine. Chester was my only real companion for 14 years. He slept at the foot of my bed. He waited by the window every afternoon when I came home from work. He had this habit of tilting his head whenever I spoke to him, like he understood every word and was genuinely interested in my rambling. Last October, the vet found a tumor in Chester's abdomen. By November, he couldn't walk anymore. I held him on the kitchen floor, the floor he'd scratched and scuffed with his nails for over a decade, and I watched him go. I buried him under the old oak tree in the backyard, the one with the tire swing that hadn't been used in years. For months, the farmhouse felt empty in a way I hadn't expected. I'd grown so used to his presence that his absence echoed through every room. I stopped talking to myself. I stopped leaving the porch light on. The silence here became something heavier than quiet. It was a Friday night in late March when I first heard it. I was in the kitchen, washing dishes. The ordinary domestic ritual that somehow manages to make the worst nights feel manageable. The faucet was running. The window above the sink looked out into the dark backyard, and beyond the yard stood the tree line, black and shapeless against the grayish sky. Then I heard barking from below me. The sound came through the floor, through the basement, a sharp, frantic barking, the kind Chester used to make when a squirrel invaded his territory, or when someone walked too close to the property at night. I dropped a plate. It shattered against the tile, but I barely registered the sound. My hands were shaking. I stood there, water still running over my fingers, and I listened. The barking continued for maybe 20 seconds, then it stopped. I dried my hands slowly. I walked to the basement door at the end of the hall, a plain white door with a brass handle, the kind you'd find in any house built before 1970. I didn't open it. I just stood there, my palm pressed flat against the wood, feeling the slight vibration of the house settling around me. Chester is dead, I told myself. I buried him. I watched him stop breathing. There's a body in the ground under the oak tree. I went to bed early that night. I didn't sleep. The next evening, I made a point of staying busy. I fixed the fence gate that had been sagging for months. I cleaned out the garage. I played music on my phone, something loud and meaningless, just to fill the silence. By 9 o'clock, my hands were raw from physical labor, and I felt exhausted enough to believe I might actually rest. I was wrong. At 11:47 p.m., I was brushing my teeth in the upstairs bathroom when I heard it again, the same barking, same location. Rising up through the floor vents, through the ductwork, into the bathroom where I stood with my mouth full of foam and my heart slamming against my ribs. This time, it lasted longer, almost a full minute. I spit out the toothpaste. I rinsed the brush. I walked downstairs because I couldn't stand not knowing. I opened the basement door and clicked on the light. The stairs descended into a dim space, the bulb at the bottom burning with a sickly yellow glow. I could see the concrete floor, the shelves full of my grandfather's old junk, the water heater humming in the corner. Nothing moved down there. Nothing breathed. I descended the stairs slowly, each step creaking under my weight. The basement smelled like earth and rust, and something faintly organic. Decay, maybe, though it could have been the pile of old potatoes in the corner my grandfather used to store for winter. My eyes swept the space. Shelves, boxes, the ancient furnace that had been here when I was a kid, the window well near the far wall, the glass thick with grime and dead leaves. No dog, no living thing except me. I went back upstairs. I locked the basement door, a habit I'd never had before. Then I went to my bedroom and sat on the edge of the bed, not lying down, just sitting with my hands on my knees and my mind spiraling. A rational explanation, I thought. Rats. Maybe there's an animal living down there, a stray cat that got in somehow. These old farmhouses have gaps everywhere. Animals get in all the time. I knew I was lying to myself. Chester's bark was distinctive, a particular pitch, a particular rhythm. I'd heard it 10,000 times over 14 years. I knew that sound the way I knew my own breathing. Whatever made that noise was not a rat or a stray cat. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the lights on until dawn bled through the curtains. And when morning came, I felt hollow and wrong, like something had scooped out the inside of my chest while I wasn't paying attention. By Monday, I had talked myself into believing I was simply grieving. Chester had been dead for 5 months. The human mind does strange things when it loses something important. It creates echoes, fills silence with remembered sounds, conjures presence from absence. I scheduled an appointment with Dr. Lawrence, my GP, and asked about sleep medication. She gave me a prescription for Ambien and told me to give it time. That night, I took a pill and lay in bed watching the ceiling. The medication made my thoughts sluggish and warm, like pushing through fog. I was almost asleep when I heard the barking again. It was different this time. It was closer. The sound was no longer coming from beneath me, from the basement below the floor. It was coming from the stairs, from the hallway outside my bedroom door. The frantic barking was right there, right outside, as if whatever was making the noise had climbed all the way up from the basement and was standing just beyond the thin wood panel that separated us. I couldn't move. The Ambien had frozen my muscles, turned my limbs to stone. I lay there in the dark, staring at the door, listening to the barking grow louder, more desperate, more real. Then it stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard something else. A soft, wet sound, like breathing, like something exhaling through a throat that was too damaged to manage it properly. The breathing continued for perhaps 30 seconds. Slow, labored, wrong. Then footsteps. Not the clicking of claws on hardwood, something heavier, something dragging, sliding, moving with deliberate weight down the hallway. The sound passed my door and continued toward the stairs. I heard it descend, each step creaking under a burden that should not have been there. I never went back to sleep. I stayed in bed until sunrise, every muscle locked, every nerve screaming, watching the door and waiting for it to open. Morning came slowly. I waited until the light through the windows was bright and steady before I finally moved. I checked every room in the house, every closet, every corner, every piece of furniture that might hide something. Nothing. But on the kitchen floor, near the basement door, I found a smear, dark and wet, maybe 3 inches long. I knelt and touched it. The substance was thick and cold. I brought my finger to my nose and smelled it. Copper, rust, the unmistakable metallic tang of old blood. I should have called someone. I should have had the house searched, the property examined, the basement checked for whatever animal was making those sounds and leaving those marks. But I didn't, because something in me, the part that was still thinking coherently through all the fear, understood that the marks weren't coming from an animal. The smear on the floor was the right color, the right consistency, but it was in the wrong place. Animals don't bleed from nowhere and leave trails leading down into the dark. I spent the next 3 days in a state of fractured sanity. I went to work. I answered emails. I attended meetings and made small talk in the break room. But at night, I didn't go home. I drove to Columbus and checked into a motel off the interstate. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself I just needed space and time to think clearly. On the 4th night, I came back. I don't know why. Some part of me, the part that had grown up in this house, the part that remembered my grandfather's stories about the land and its history, understood that running wouldn't help. Whatever was happening in that farmhouse had attached itself to something deeper than geography. Running to Columbus, running to California, running to another country wouldn't change anything. I arrived at dusk. The sun was bleeding out over the tree line, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like something burning. I stood in the driveway and stared at the house. It looked the same as always. The peeling paint, the sagging porch, the old porch swing my grandfather had built decades ago. Normal, ordinary, haunted by nothing except memories and dust. I went inside. I checked every room. I stood in the basement doorway and breathed in the smell of earth and rust, and I tried to convince myself that everything was fine. That night, I made a choice. I would stay. I would face whatever was in that house, and I would understand it. I descended the basement stairs with a flashlight and a knife, a pathetic weapon, but something to hold on to. The flashlight cut a beam through the darkness, illuminating dust motes and spider webs and the forgotten detritus of decades. I walked every inch of that space. I checked behind the furnace. I moved the old boxes and crates. I examined the window well and the walls and the floor. At the far corner, behind a stack of wooden pallets that hadn't been moved in years, I found the photograph. It was old, the edges brown and brittle. A family portrait. A woman in a long dress, 2 children standing beside her, and a man whose face was obscured by some kind of stain. They were posed in front of a farmhouse that looked remarkably like the one I was standing in. Written on the back, in faded pencil, "The Hendersons, 1951. Below the photograph, scratched into the concrete floor, were words, carved by something sharp, deliberate, done over and over until the letters were deep enough to see. 3 words. He never left. I stood there, staring at those words, and I understood that I wasn't dealing with a ghost. I wasn't dealing with grief or madness or a dog that somehow wasn't dead. The house had a history. The land had a history. And something in that history was still present, still active, still hungry. The next morning, I went to the county records office. I spent hours digging through archives, searching for information about the property and everyone who had ever lived there. What I found was fragmentary. Old newspaper clippings, property transfers, census records, but it was enough to piece together something terrible. In 1951, a family named Henderson lived in the farmhouse. The father, Thomas Henderson, was a disturbed man with a history of violence. In October of that year, his wife and children disappeared. Neighbors reported hearing screams in the night. When authorities investigated, they found no bodies. Thomas Henderson claimed his family had simply left one morning, packed up and abandoned him for reasons he couldn't understand. He was never believed. He died in a mental institution in 1959, but not before telling anyone who would listen that his family had not left. He said they were still in the house. He said they were waiting. He said they were angry. I returned to the farmhouse that evening. I don't know if I intended to do something specific, exorcise the place, call a priest, sell the property and run, but I knew I couldn't ignore what I'd learned. The house wasn't haunted by Chester's spirit. Chester was just the bait. Whatever lived in the basement had been using his memory, his presence in my life, to draw me deeper. That night, I didn't wait in my bedroom. I went down to the kitchen and sat at the table. I left the lights on. I sat with my hands folded and my eyes on the basement door, and I waited. At 11:47 p.m., the same time as always, the barking started. But this time, I was ready. I stood up and walked to the basement door. I unlocked it. I opened it wide. The barking stopped. The breathing started. That wet, labored sound from the hallway, but closer now, much closer, rising up from the bottom of the stairs where the darkness pooled like something liquid. I didn't flinch. I didn't run. I descended into the basement, flashlight in hand, and I walked toward the breathing. In the corner, behind the furnace, I saw it. It was Chester, but not Chester. The shape was wrong, stretched and broken. The proportions twisted like something trying to approximate a dog, but failing. The eyes were black and wet and far too large. The mouth hung open, and from somewhere deep inside that ruined throat came the sound of breathing, the sound of barking, the sound of something that had learned to imitate my dog perfectly. It saw me, those terrible black eyes fixed on my face, and in a voice that was not a dog's voice, in a whisper that came from everywhere and nowhere, it said my name. Marcus. I dropped the flashlight. I ran. I didn't stop until I was in my car, tearing down Route 12, leaving the farmhouse and everything in it behind forever. I'm writing this from a motel room in Indianapolis. I've sold the property to a real estate investor who asked no questions. I never want to see that place again. But last night, as I was falling asleep, I heard a sound from the bathroom. The scratching of nails on tile. A wet, labored breathing. And somewhere, far away, a dog began to bark.